The morning of March 7, 1943, above the rail yards at Smolensk, a Bell P-39 Airacobra bearing Soviet red stars banked hard through scattered clouds at 4,000 feet. Senior Lieutenant Aleksandr Pokryshkin advanced the throttle of his Allison V-1710 engine and felt the aircraft respond with its characteristic nose-heavy acceleration. Below him, a German supply train sat motionless on the tracks, its locomotive venting steam into the frigid air while crew members worked frantically to clear ice from the switching mechanism that had stranded them in the open. Pokryshkin had flown American fighters before the P-40 Warhawk with its distinctive shark mouth and the bulky P-47 Thunderbolt that Soviet pilots called the Samovar for its rotund fuselage. But the Airacobra felt different in his hands. The mid-mounted engine, placed directly behind the cockpit, created an unusual center of gravity that made the aircraft twitchy in certain flight regimes, prone to tumbling into flat spins if mishandled during slow-speed maneuvering. American pilots had rejected it for high-altitude fighter combat over Europe, where its performance degraded severely above 15,000 feet due to the lack of an effective supercharger. But Pokryshkin was not flying at 15,000 feet. He was diving toward a stationary locomotive, and the weapon mounted in the nose of his aircraft, a 37mm M4 cannon firing through the propeller hub, was about to demonstrate why Soviet pilots had requested every Airacobra the Americans could spare. The question that would perplex German intelligence officers for months afterward was simple. How had an aircraft the Luftwaffe openly mocked as obsolete and unsuitable for modern combat become one of the most feared ground attack platforms on the Eastern Front? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The 37mm cannon represented the heaviest armament ever installed as standard equipment in a single-engine American fighter. Each high-explosive round weighed just over 1.5 pounds and contained enough explosive filler to penetrate light armor, demolish structures, and as German locomotive crews would soon discover, punch catastrophic holes through the boilers, cylinders, and mechanical assemblies of steam locomotives. The cannon fired at a relatively sedate rate of 140 to 150 rounds per minute, far slower than the rapid-fire machine guns that equipped most fighters. But what the M4 lacked in rate of fire, it compensated for through the sheer destructive power of each individual round. Pokryshkin lined up his approach carefully, watching the locomotive grow larger in his gun sight. The train crew had abandoned their efforts to free the frozen switch and were now running toward the tree line, their dark figures leaving trails in the snow. He pressed the firing button. The cannon produced a distinctive, deep thumping sound, felt as much as heard through the airframe as the recoil system absorbed the weapon's substantial kick. The first round struck the boiler near the firebox. The second and third rounds followed within a half second, walking up the length of the locomotive as Pokryshkin adjusted his aim. The boiler erupted in a violent explosion of superheated steam and shattered metal, the overpressure tearing apart seams and rivets that had been designed to contain 300 pounds per square inch of steam pressure under normal operating conditions. The locomotive came apart with surprising thoroughness, its mechanical components scattering across the railbed as escaping steam enveloped the wreckage in a white cloud. Pokryshkin pulled up sharply, clearing the rising steam and smoke, banking to observe the results of his attack. The train behind the destroyed locomotive sat intact but immobilized, its cargo of supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements stranded 60 kilometers behind German lines, with the spring Rasputitsa, the season of mud, approaching rapidly. This was not the air war the Luftwaffe had prepared to fight. The Bell P-39 Airacobra entered United States Army Air Forces service in 1941 amid considerable optimism from its designers and skepticism from pilots who would be required to fly it. Bell Aircraft Corporation had created an unconventional design that placed the Allison V-1710 engine behind the pilot's seat, connected to the propeller through a long drive shaft that passed beneath the cockpit floor. This unusual configuration allowed the installation of the 37mm M4 cannon directly in the nose, firing through the propeller hub where it could be aimed with precision using the aircraft's gun sight without the convergence problems that plagued wing-mounted weapons. The design philosophy seemed sound in theory. By mounting the engine at the aircraft's center of gravity rather than in the nose, Bell's engineers believed they could create a more maneuverable fighter with better mass distribution for aerobatic performance. The heavy cannon in the nose would be balanced by the engine weight aft, creating what should have been a beautifully harmonized aircraft. Wind tunnel testing and initial flight trials suggested the configuration worked as intended, producing an aircraft with excellent low-altitude performance and devastating firepower. Reality proved more complicated than theory suggested. The Allison engine, without an effective high-altitude supercharger, lost power dramatically above 12,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, where much of the air combat over Western Europe occurred, the P-39's performance degraded to levels that made it dangerously vulnerable to German fighters optimized for high-altitude interception. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf WU-190 maintained good performance well above 20,000 feet, allowing German pilots to dictate engagement terms by attacking from superior altitude with speed advantage. American test pilots who evaluated the Airacobra for combat operations over Europe delivered harsh assessments. The aircraft could not climb quickly enough to intercept high-altitude bomber formations. It could not maintain sufficient speed at altitude to catch fleeing enemy fighters. The unusual engine placement created a dangerous tendency toward flat spins during certain maneuvers, particularly if the pilot allowed airspeed to decay too far during turning combat. Recovery from these spins proved difficult and sometimes impossible, with several test pilots killed during evaluation flights when their aircraft entered unrecoverable spin modes. The car door-style side entry, while convenient on the ground, created concerns about emergency egress. The pilot had to jettison the door completely before attempting to bail out, adding precious seconds to an escape sequence that might occur while the aircraft was spinning, on fire, or both. British Royal Air Force pilots who received early production Airacobras through Lend-Lease channels flew exactly one operational sortie before declaring the type completely unsuitable for combat over Europe and relegating the aircraft to training duties far from combat zones. By mid-1942, American fighter squadrons destined for Europe were receiving P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs instead of P-39 seconds. The Airacobra had been tried, evaluated, and found wanting for the air war over Western Europe. Production continued primarily because the aircraft performed adequately in other theaters, where high-altitude performance mattered less, and because American factories needed time to retool for production of more capable types. The Luftwaffe intelligence officers who compiled reports on Allied aircraft capabilities noted the Airacobra's specifications, with professional interest but little concern. Here was an American fighter that could not effectively contest airspace above 15,000 feet, could not escort heavy bombers, could not outrun or outclimb German interceptors, and possessed handling characteristics that made it dangerous to its own pilots. Intelligence assessments circulated through Luftwaffe units characterized the P-39 as representative of American design philosophy, adequate for colonial policing and ground support in primitive theaters, but fundamentally outclassed by modern European combat aircraft developed through years of high-intensity warfare. German pilots who encountered the few P-39 seconds that reached combat zones in the Mediterranean theater confirmed these assessments. The Airacobra could be dangerous in specific circumstances if American pilots used careful energy management and fought on their own terms at low altitude. But any German pilot with altitude advantage could simply dive away from an engagement whenever circumstances became unfavorable, and the P-39 lacked sufficient performance to pursue effectively. This comfortable dismissal of the Airacobra as an inferior design would persist among Luftwaffe pilots and intelligence officers until Soviet pilots began demonstrating what the aircraft could actually accomplish when employed according to its genuine strengths rather than forced into roles for which it was fundamentally unsuited. The first Bell P-39 Airacobras arrived in the Soviet Union during late 1941 and early 1942 through the perilous Lend-Lease convoy routes that connected American production with Soviet. forces fighting desperately to halt the German advance. These aircraft travelled by ship through the Arctic waters north of Norway to the ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, running a gauntlet of German U-boats, surface raiders, and Luftwaffe bombers that sank dozens of Allied cargo vessels laden with tanks, trucks, ammunition, and aircraft, destined for the Eastern Front. Soviet pilots and ground crews who received the first Airacobras examined them with professional curiosity mixed with considerable skepticism. The aircraft bore no resemblance to Soviet fighters they had trained on. The Yakovlev Yak-1 and Yak-7 featured conventional layouts with engines mounted in the nose, simple systems, and rugged construction that prioritized ease of maintenance under primitive field conditions. The Lavochkin La-5 used a massive radial engine that could absorb battle damage and continue operating. The Airacobra, by contrast, appeared fragile and complicated, with its unusual engine placement, long drive shaft, and unfamiliar American instrumentation marked in English units that required mental conversion. Soviet maintenance personnel struggled initially with the Airacobra's more complex systems and the chronic shortage of proper tools, technical manuals, and spare parts. American aircraft required different fasteners, different fuel specifications, and different maintenance procedures than Soviet designs. Mechanics accustomed to working on simple, robust Soviet fighters found themselves confronting reduction gearboxes, oxygen systems, and radio equipment far more sophisticated than anything in Soviet production aircraft. The aircraft's armament created particular interest. Soviet fighters typically carried rapid-fire 20mm cannon and 12.7mm machine guns, effective weapons, but lacking the sheer destructive power of the American 37mm cannon mounted in the P-39's nose. Soviet armament specialists recognized immediately that this weapon represented something fundamentally different from conventional fighter armament. The 37mm rounds could destroy targets that resisted machine gun and light cannon fire, armored vehicles, fortified positions, locomotives, and the increasingly common German tanks, whose armor had grown thicker with each new model. But Soviet tactical doctrine for fighter employment differed fundamentally from American and British approaches in ways that would prove decisive for the Airacobra's operational success. Western air forces emphasized high-altitude bomber escort, strategic interdiction, and gaining air superiority through fighter versus fighter combat at altitude. Soviet doctrine, forged in the brutal ground combat on the Eastern Front, prioritized direct support of ground forces, destruction of enemy logistics, and low-altitude attacks against German supply lines, artillery positions, and transportation networks. The Eastern Front Air War occurred primarily below 10,000 feet, where Soviet and German aircraft tangled in savage low-altitude combat directly above advancing infantry and tank formations. German Stukas and ground attack aircraft struck Soviet positions continuously, while Soviet Sturmovix reciprocated against German forces. This was not the gentlemanly high-altitude combat over Western Europe, where fighters engaged in relatively clean one-on-one duels. This was brutal, close-range combat where aircraft flew through ground fire, operated from crude dirt airstrips mere kilometers behind the front lines, and focused primarily on destroying ground targets rather than achieving air superiority through fighter combat. In this environment, the Airacobra's limitations at high altitude became irrelevant, while its strengths, the devastating 37mm cannon, good low-altitude performance, decent speed below 10,000 feet, and excellent visibility from the cockpit, suddenly became decisive advantages. Soviet pilots recognized that the Americans had inadvertently created the perfect ground attack platform for Eastern Front conditions, even though American doctrine had never envisioned using the aircraft in this role. Aleksandr Ivanovich Pokryshkin had joined the Soviet Air Force in 1934 as a young mechanic, working on aircraft, engines and airframes before earning his pilot's wings through sheer persistence and demonstrated technical aptitude. By 1943, he had accumulated combat experience that few pilots survived long enough to acquire over 400 combat sorties against Luftwaffe fighters and German ground targets across the desperate battles of 1941 and 1942. Pokryshkin approached the Airacobra with the methodical mindset of an engineer, rather than the instinctive reactions of a pure fighter pilot. He studied the aircraft's specifications carefully, analyzing its performance envelope to identify the specific flight regimes where it excelled and the conditions under which it became vulnerable. The 37mm cannon particularly interested him, not as a weapon for destroying other fighters, though it could certainly accomplish that when opportunity arose, but as an instrument for systematic destruction of German logistics infrastructure. Soviet intelligence had identified German dependence on rail transportation as a critical vulnerability in their Eastern Front operations. The vast distances, primitive road networks, and seasonal mud that rendered unpaved routes impassable for months each year meant that German forces relied overwhelmingly on railways to move supplies, reinforcements, ammunition, fuel, and food from railheads in Poland and occupied Soviet territory to combat units at the front. Destroy the locomotives, and entire German divisions would slowly starve, their artillery would fall silent for lack of shells, and their tanks would become immobile for want of fuel. The German railway system in occupied Soviet territories operated with remarkable efficiency considering the challenges. Specialized railway troops repaired partisan sabotage damage, maintained track in harsh weather conditions, and operated repair facilities that could rebuild damaged locomotives. But locomotives themselves represented irreplaceable assets that German industry struggled to produce in sufficient quantities. Each locomotive destroyed meant one less train delivering supplies to German forces, and German factories could not manufacture new locomotives quickly enough to replace combat losses while simultaneously supporting expanded operations deeper into Soviet territory. Pokryshkin developed specific tactics for attacking locomotives that maximized the Airacobra's capabilities while minimizing exposure to German anti-aircraft fire. He would approach at medium altitude between 3,000 and 5,000 feet, where the aircraft maintained good speed and maneuverability, while remaining high enough to avoid most light anti-aircraft weapons. German trains typically traveled with flak cars mounting 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns, creating dangerous defensive fire that could shred an attacking aircraft if the pilot approached carelessly at low altitude. The attack profile Pokryshkin perfected involved a diving approach from altitude, building speed to make his aircraft a difficult target for anti-aircraft gunners tracking manually with mechanical sights. He would aim for the locomotive's boiler, the massive cylindrical pressure vessel that contained superheated water and steam under pressure sufficient to drive the pistons that turned the wheels. A single 37mm high-explosive round penetrating the boiler created catastrophic overpressure that would rupture the boiler seams, destroy the firebox, and render the locomotive irreparable without complete rebuilding at a major facility. The typical attack run lasted less than 10 seconds from the moment Pokryshkin opened fire until he pulled up and away from the target. In that brief interval, he would fire between 8 and 12 rounds from the 37mm cannon, walking his fire along the length of the locomotive to ensure hits on critical components. The cannon's recoil created a distinctive pulsing sensation through the airframe, each shot pushing the nose slightly off target before the aircraft's stability returned. Experienced pilots learned to compensate for this recoil, maintaining accurate fire through the brief engagement. After destroying the locomotive, Pokryshkin would typically not remain in the area to attack the train cars themselves. German anti-aircraft crews would be fully alert after the initial attack, and subsequent passes against stationary targets exposed the attacking aircraft to concentrated defensive fire from multiple guns. The tactical objective was locomotive destruction, not maximizing the spectacle of explosions. A destroyed locomotive meant an immobilized train mission accomplished. The train's cargo would be captured by advancing Soviet forces or destroyed later by artillery or follow-up air attacks under more favorable conditions. Soviet aviation regiments, equipped with Airacobras, developed systematic approaches to locomotive hunting that reflected careful operational planning rather than random opportunistic attacks. Intelligence officers maintained detailed maps of German rail networks in occupied territories, marking known repair facilities, major junctions, supply depots, and the typical routes used for moving supplies toward the front. Soviet partisans operating behind German lines provided regular reports on train movements, schedules, and German security measures, creating an intelligence picture that allowed Soviet commanders to direct airstrikes against the most valuable targets. Pilots received specific target assignments rather than simply being told to attack any train they encountered. A regiment might be tasked with disrupting rail traffic in a particular sector to support an upcoming ground offensive, with individual flights assigned to patrol specific sections of track during designated time windows when intelligence indicated trains would be moving. This systematic approach maximized the operational impact of each mission, ensuring that destroyed locomotives created cascading logistical problems for German forces rather than isolated inconveniences. The Aerocobra's cockpit layout facilitated these precision attacks through excellent visibility and well-designed gun sights. The pilot sat high in the fuselage with large windows providing unobstructed views forward and to the sides, critical for spotting trains against the varied terrain of forests, fields, and small villages that characterized much of the Eastern Front. The reflector gun sight projected a reticle onto a clear glass panel directly in the pilot's line of sight, allowing accurate aiming without requiring the pilot to look down at mechanical sights or lose situational awareness. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The spring of 1943 marked a critical period in the Eastern Front Air War, as Soviet forces prepared major offensives designed to exploit German overextension following the disaster at Stalingrad. German forces had retreated from the Caucasus and shortened their defensive lines, but they remained deep inside Soviet territory and dependent on vulnerable supply lines stretching hundreds of kilometers from railheads in occupied Poland through partisan-infested forests and countryside. Soviet aviation commanders recognized that German logistics represented a more vulnerable target than German combat units. Attacking German tanks, artillery, and infantry directly meant confronting concentrated anti-aircraft defenses and accepting high aircraft losses for modest tactical gains. Attacking German supply trains meant striking softer targets that, when destroyed, degraded German combat effectiveness more thoroughly than direct attacks on combat units could achieve. In March 1943, the 16th Air Army supporting Soviet ground forces in the Smolensk region received orders to intensify interdiction operations against German rail traffic. Intelligence indicated that German forces were stockpiling supplies for potential offensive operations later in the spring, with dozens of trains daily moving ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements toward forward staging areas. Soviet commanders wanted this flow disrupted, forcing German units to consume their existing stockpiles without replenishment. Pokryshkin's regiment, the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment equipped primarily with Airacobras, received assignment to a sector encompassing approximately 200 kilometers of German-controlled railway. Their mission was simple in concept but demanding in execution: destroy every locomotive that attempted to transit that sector, make the railways unusable, force German forces to rely on truck transport over primitive roads that would become impassable once the spring thaw transformed them into rivers of mud. The campaign began on March 5, 1943, with coordinated strikes by multiple Soviet aviation regiments against German rail targets across a front spanning hundreds of kilometers. The objective was simultaneous disruption of German logistics throughout the entire central sector, preventing German forces from simply rerouting traffic around damaged sections of track. Soviet planners understood that attacking railways required sustained pressure rather than isolated strikes. German railway troops could repair damaged track within hours or days, but destroyed locomotives required weeks or months to replace. Pokryshkin led the initial strike personally, taking off before dawn from a crude dirt airstrip located 30 kilometers behind Soviet lines. The airfield consisted of leveled ground, some portable fuel bladders protected by earthen revetments, and canvas tents housing maintenance crews and pilots. No concrete runways, no permanent structures, no elaborate facilities, just functional, minimalism that allowed rapid relocation when German forces threatened the position. The flight of 4 Airacobras flew at low altitude to avoid German radar detection, following the irregular terrain at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. The morning air remained bitterly cold despite the calendar indicating spring's approach, and frost covered the canopy edges where heating was insufficient. Pokryshkin monitored his engine instruments carefully. The Allison required attentive management, particularly during warm-up and initial climb, when cylinder head temperatures could spike dangerously if the pilot advanced throttle too aggressively. The target appeared exactly where intelligence had indicated, a freight train of approximately 40 cars moving south toward German positions, its locomotive producing a dark smoke trail visible for kilometers against the pale morning sky. The train traveled at moderate speed through open farmland, following a raised railway embankment that made it clearly visible from the air. No immediate signs of anti-aircraft defenses were visible, though Pokryshkin knew the train almost certainly carried flak cars somewhere in the consist. He signaled his wingman and began his attack run from 4,000 feet, diving at an angle calculated to build speed while maintaining stable gun platform characteristics. The locomotive grew rapidly larger in his gun sight, a German Class 52 Kriegslokomotive, one of the simplified wartime designs produced in large numbers specifically for military transportation requirements. These locomotives were built to be functional rather than sophisticated, with minimal non-essential components and straightforward maintenance requirements. They were also built to be destroyed by 37mm cannon fire. Pokryshkin pressed the firing button at 800 meters range. The cannon produced its characteristic deep thumping sound as the first rounds departed. He watched the tracers arc downward toward the locomotive, making minute corrections to walk his fire onto the target. The first round struck the tender immediately behind the locomotive. The second hit the boiler near the cab. The third and fourth rounds impacted the boiler's center section in quick succession. The boiler explosion occurred almost instantaneously, a violent eruption of superheated steam and metal fragments that enveloped the entire locomotive in white vapor. The explosion's force derailed several cars immediately behind the locomotive, twisting them off the tracks and down the embankment. Pokryshkin pulled up sharply, clearing the rising steam cloud, and glanced back to observe the results. The locomotive had effectively ceased to exist as a functional machine, its boiler torn open and its mechanical components scattered across the railbed. His wingman attacked next, targeting a second locomotive that German railway crews had coupled to the rear of the train to assist with the heavy load, a common practice on routes with significant grades. The second locomotive died as thoroughly as the first, its boiler ruptured by multiple cannon hits. The train sat motionless on the tracks, immobilized far from any repair facility, its cargo of supplies stranded until German railway troops could bring replacement locomotives through what was rapidly becoming a very dangerous section of track. German intelligence officers first noted the increased Soviet attacks on railway targets as a minor tactical adjustment rather than a systematic campaign. Individual train attacks occurred regularly throughout the Eastern Front, as Soviet aircraft opportunistically struck targets when circumstances allowed. What changed in March 1943 was the scale, coordination, and devastating effectiveness of these attacks, particularly those conducted by Soviet fighters equipped with large-caliber cannon. Luftwaffe liaison officers attached to German army railway operations began receiving increasingly urgent reports from train crews and railway security units about Soviet fighter attacks that completely destroyed locomotives with just a few cannon hits. The reports described aircraft approaching at medium altitude, diving on locomotives with extraordinary accuracy, and achieving catastrophic kills with brief firing passes that left locomotives as smoking wreckage unsuitable even for salvage. The descriptions puzzled German intelligence analysts initially. Soviet fighters typically attacked with 20mm cannon and heavy machine guns, weapons effective against personnel, light vehicles, and unarmored targets, but generally insufficient to destroy a locomotive's massive boiler and mechanical assemblies with a handful of hits. Locomotives were built robustly with thick steel boilers designed to contain tremendous internal pressure. They resisted battle damage well, often surviving multiple machine gun hits and continuing operation with degraded but functional capability. These new attacks produced fundamentally different results. Locomotives were not merely damaged but completely destroyed. Their boilers ruptured explosively, their mechanical components wrecked beyond any possibility of field repair. German railway officials found themselves facing a crisis where undamaged sections of track sat unused because insufficient locomotives remained operational to move trains. Repair facilities could fix track damage quickly, but could not rebuild destroyed locomotives without extensive workshop time and spare parts that were themselves becoming scarce. German anti-aircraft defences proved inadequate against the Soviet tactics. The standard flak cars attached to trains mounted 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns with mechanical sights requiring manual tracking. These weapons performed reasonably well against low-altitude attackers flying predictable approaches, but struggled to engage fast-moving targets attacking from medium altitude in diving approaches that gave gunners only seconds to acquire the target, calculate lead, and fire effectively. German railway officials requested increased anti-aircraft protection for high-value trains, but Luftwaffe resources were stretched impossibly thin across multiple fronts. Anti-aircraft guns and trained crews represented finite resources needed everywhere simultaneously, protecting cities from Allied strategic bombing, defending frontline positions from Soviet ground attack aircraft, guarding airfields and supply depots, and now supposedly protecting every train moving through partisan territory. The arithmetic simply did not work. There were never enough guns, never enough ammunition, never sufficient trained crews to protect everything that required protection. Luftwaffe fighter units received instructions to provide air cover for important trains during critical movements, but this proved operationally impractical for sustained implementation. German fighters had insufficient fuel and pilot hours available to maintain continuous combat air patrols over railway routes stretching hundreds of kilometers. Soviet fighters could choose when and where to attack, forcing German defenders into reactive postures where they consistently arrived too late to prevent attacks or found themselves unable to locate Soviet aircraft that attacked quickly and departed before German fighters could intercept. German intelligence eventually identified the weapon, causing such catastrophic locomotive damage. The American 37mm cannon installed in Lend-Lease Bell P-39 Airacobra fighters that the Soviets were operating in increasing numbers. Luftwaffe assessments of the Airacobra underwent rapid and uncomfortable revision, as intelligence officers confronted the reality that an aircraft they had dismissed as obsolete and unsuitable for modern combat was systematically destroying German logistics infrastructure with remarkable effectiveness. The intelligence reports attempting to explain this uncomfortable reality to senior Luftwaffe commanders made for awkward reading. Officers had to acknowledge that their previous assessments of the Airacobra's capabilities had been fundamentally wrong, not because German intelligence had misunderstood the aircraft's specifications, but because they had evaluated it according to inappropriate criteria. The Airacobra was indeed unsuitable for high-altitude fighter combat over Western Europe, but nobody was fighting at high altitude over the Eastern Front. The Soviets were using the Airacobra for low-altitude ground attack and interdiction, roles for which the aircraft's combination of heavy cannon armament and adequate low-altitude performance made it devastatingly effective. German technical intelligence officers who examined, captured or crashed Airacobras found themselves grudgingly impressed by specific design elements, particularly the nose-mounted cannon installation that allowed accurate fire without convergence issues that plagued wing-mounted weapons. A pilot aiming the aircraft at a target automatically aimed the cannon with precision, limited only by the gunsight's accuracy and the pilot's skill. The 37mm M4 cannon fired high-explosive rounds that contained sufficient explosive filler to punch through locomotive boilers, destroy light armor, and demolish structures with single hits. The realization spread gradually through Luftwaffe intelligence circles during spring and summer 1943 that the Americans had inadvertently created an aircraft perfectly optimized for Soviet tactical requirements, Even though American doctrine had envisioned entirely different employment, the Soviets had recognized this potential where Western air forces had not, and were exploiting it systematically to destroy German logistics infrastructure in ways that degraded German combat effectiveness more thoroughly than direct attacks on combat units could achieve. German attempts to counter the locomotive attacks through tactical adjustments achieved only limited success. Railway officials experimented with moving high-value trains primarily at night, but Soviet pilots adapted by conducting dawn and dusk attacks when trains remained visible while darkness complicated anti-aircraft fire. German forces attempted to establish fighter patrols over critical railway sections, but Soviet intelligence identified these patterns and simply attacked different sections, while German fighters waited uselessly over protected routes. German railway troops worked frantically to repair damaged track and replace destroyed locomotives, but Soviet attacks outpaced German repair capacity, creating a steadily worsening logistics crisis. By mid-1943, German commanders facing Soviet offensives found themselves fighting with inadequate ammunition, insufficient fuel, and delayed reinforcements because the railways that should have delivered these supplies were disrupted by systematic Soviet interdiction. German combat units remained formidable when properly supplied, but even the best troops became ineffective when their artillery fell silent for lack of shells, their tanks sat immobile for want of fuel, and their wounded could not be evacuated because no trains reached rear-area hospitals. By the summer of 1943, Soviet aviation regiments equipped with Airacobras had destroyed hundreds of German locomotives across the Eastern Front, creating cascading logistics failures that degraded German combat effectiveness more thoroughly than direct battlefield losses could achieve. Aleksandr Pokryshkin personally accounted for dozens of locomotive kills, though Soviet record-keeping focused more on enemy aircraft destroyed than ground targets eliminated, making precise statistics difficult to verify from surviving documentation. The impact on German railway operations became severe enough that senior Wehrmacht commanders began filing formal complaints with the High Command about inadequate locomotive availability. German forces discovered themselves fighting a different kind of war than they had prepared for, not grand armoured manoeuvres and dramatic breakthroughs, but grinding attrition where victory depended on maintaining supply flows against relentless interdiction. The Eastern Front had become, in part, a war of logistics destruction, where Soviet pilots hunted locomotives with the same systematic intensity German U-boats had once hunted Allied merchant ships. German industry attempted to compensate through increased locomotive production, but German factories faced impossible competing demands. Resources allocated to locomotive production meant fewer tanks, fewer aircraft, fewer trucks, and less ammunition. The German war economy operated under conditions of total mobilization by 1943, with every factory, every worker, and every ton of steel already committed to war production at maximum sustainable rates. There were no idle resources waiting to be mobilized, no reserve capacity that could simply be activated to produce additional locomotives without reducing production of something else equally critical. The mathematics of attrition worked inexorably against German forces. Soviet pilots destroyed locomotives faster than German factories could replace them, while simultaneously Soviet industry, supplemented by Lend-Lease equipment, produced increasing quantities of aircraft, ammunition, and supplies. German railway operations deteriorated steadily throughout 1943 and into 1944, as the cumulative effect of hundreds of destroyed locomotives created a transportation crisis that German logistics personnel could not solve through harder work or better organization. Pokryshkin's personal combat record reflected his systematic approach to both air combat and ground attack missions. He achieved 59 confirmed aerial victories against Luftwaffe aircraft, an impressive total that placed him among the Soviet Union's leading aces, but his contribution to Soviet victory extended well beyond fighter versus fighter combat. His development and refinement of locomotive attack tactics created a methodology that other Soviet pilots could replicate, spreading effective interdiction techniques throughout Soviet aviation units equipped with cannon-armed fighters. The Soviet Air Force recognized the Airacobra's value explicitly through their continued requests for additional aircraft throughout the war. While American and British forces largely abandoned the P-39 for frontline combat duties in Europe after early combat trials demonstrated its limitations at high altitude, Soviet forces requested every Airacobra the United States could provide through Lend-Lease channels. American factories eventually delivered over 4,700 Airacobras to Soviet forces, more than half of total P-39 production, representing the largest single transfer of any American fighter type to Soviet service. Soviet pilots appreciated specific characteristics that made the Airacobra suitable for Eastern Front conditions. The aircraft's relatively simple systems proved maintainable under primitive field conditions, despite being more complex than Soviet designs. The nose-mounted cannon installation allowed accurate fire against ground targets without the convergence problems that reduced effectiveness of wing-mounted weapons. The cockpit heating system, a luxury compared to Soviet fighters that often lacked effective heating, made multi-hour missions at altitude more tolerable during brutal Russian winters when temperatures regularly fell below -30 degrees Celsius. Soviet mechanics developed extensive practical knowledge about maintaining Airacobras under field conditions that would have horrified American technical representatives. They improvised repairs using locally manufactured parts when proper American spare parts were unavailable, adapted Soviet instruments and radios when American equipment failed, and developed maintenance procedures that kept aircraft flying despite supply chain disruptions and parts shortages. The aircraft proved remarkably tolerant of these improvised approaches, continuing to operate effectively despite modifications and repairs that departed significantly from factory specifications. German intelligence assessments of Soviet Airacobra operations grew increasingly detailed and grudgingly respectful as the war progressed. Luftwaffe pilots learned to treat Soviet P-39 seconds with caution, particularly at low altitude where the aircraft's performance remained competitive and that massive nose-mounted cannon could destroy German fighters with single hits. The psychological impact of facing an opponent armed with a cannon firing 1.5-pound high-explosive shells created distinct wariness among German pilots accustomed to being hit multiple times by machine gun fire, without catastrophic damage. One 37mm hit could remove a wing, destroy an engine, or kill the pilot instantly through explosive effects rather than simple penetration. The Airacobra's operational success on the Eastern Front created uncomfortable questions for Western air forces about doctrinal assumptions and aircraft evaluation criteria. American and British assessments had judged the P-39 unsuitable for combat, based on its performance in high-altitude fighter escort and interception roles, missions that represented Western tactical priorities but had little relevance to Eastern Front conditions. Soviet forces had evaluated the same aircraft according to different criteria and discovered an effective ground attack platform that American doctrine had never envisioned using in that role. The divergent assessments reflected fundamentally different tactical requirements, operational conditions, and doctrinal assumptions rather than any objective truth about the aircraft's absolute capability. The story of the Airacobra on the Eastern Front reveals how tactical doctrine and operational requirements shape perceptions of technological capability in ways that can blind military organizations to alternative applications of existing equipment. American and British air forces rejected the P-39 because it failed to meet their specific requirements for high-altitude performance in the Western European Air War. This assessment was entirely accurate within that specific context. The Airacobra genuinely could not perform effectively at 20,000 feet, where much of the air combat over Germany occurred. But this accurate assessment within one tactical context created a cognitive blind spot that prevented Western air forces from recognizing the aircraft's potential effectiveness in different operational conditions. Soviet pilots fighting at low altitude over the Eastern Front faced entirely different requirements, where high-altitude performance mattered little, while heavy armament, adequate low-altitude speed, and robust construction proved decisive. The same aircraft, deemed obsolete and unsuitable by Western standards, became one of the most effective ground attack platforms on the Eastern Front when employed according to tactical doctrine that emphasized its genuine strengths. German intelligence officers experienced their own version of this doctrinal blindness. Their initial assessments of the Airacobra accurately identified its weaknesses in high-altitude fighter combat, the primary mission for which Luftwaffe fighters were optimized. These assessments led to comfortable conclusions that the P-39 represented an inferior design that posed minimal threat to German air superiority. German analysts failed to consider that Soviet forces might employ the aircraft in roles where its weaknesses became irrelevant and its strengths proved decisive. This failure of imagination reflected a broader pattern in German intelligence assessments of Soviet capabilities throughout the war. German military culture tended to evaluate Soviet equipment and tactics against German standards and doctrine, often failing to recognize that Soviet forces operated according to different assumptions that sometimes proved more appropriate for Eastern Front conditions. German officers frequently noted Soviet waste of resources on ground attack missions and misuse of fighters for close air support, never quite grasping that Soviet tactical doctrine deliberately prioritized direct support of ground forces over the independent air superiority missions that Western air forces considered primary. The Locomotive destruction campaign exemplified Soviet operational art at its most effective, identifying German vulnerabilities, concentrating available resources against those vulnerabilities systematically, and accepting tactical limitations in some areas to achieve decisive effects in others. Soviet commanders understood that they did not need to win air superiority through fighter versus fighter combat if they could render German ground forces ineffective through logistics destruction. Immobilized German tanks posed no threat regardless of their technical superiority. Silent German artillery could not support defensive operations regardless of crew skill. Starving German infantry could not hold positions regardless of their courage. Pokryshkin's career trajectory illustrated Soviet recognition of effective tactical innovation. He received the Hero of the Soviet Union award 3 times, the first Soviet pilot to achieve this distinction, and rose to command of increasingly large formations as his demonstrated competence earned promotions despite his relative modest social background. The Soviet system, despite its many dysfunctions and the political purges that had devastated the officer corps before the war, retained enough meritocratic elements to recognize and reward effective combat performance when results proved undeniable. The broader implications extended beyond individual aircraft types or tactical techniques to fundamental questions about how military organizations evaluate equipment and develop doctrine. The Airacobra's divergent fates in Western and Soviet service demonstrated that aircraft capabilities could not be assessed in abstract isolation from operational requirements and tactical employment. An aircraft was not simply good or bad in absolute terms. Its effectiveness depended entirely on how it was used, against what targets, under what conditions, and according to what tactical doctrine. Western air forces learned this lesson gradually and incompletely. The recognition that ground attack and close air support represented legitimate primary missions for fighter aircraft rather than secondary duties to be performed when air superiority had been achieved came slowly to organizations that had built their entire doctrinal structures around strategic bombing and fighter escort. American development of dedicated ground attack aircraft like the A-1 Skyraider in later conflicts reflected evolving understanding that different missions required different aircraft optimized for different performance characteristics. The German experience with Airacobra attacks on locomotives created lasting impacts on railway security doctrine in subsequent conflicts. The vulnerability of locomotives to air attack, once demonstrated thoroughly by Soviet operations, became an accepted reality that shaped military transportation planning. Railway operations in contested environments required either effective air cover or acceptance of severe losses. There was no technical solution that could make locomotives invulnerable to determined air attack by cannon-armed aircraft. German railway officials attempted various defensive measures during 1943 and 1944, increased anti-aircraft defenses on trains, camouflage measures to make locomotives less visible from the air, construction of protective shelters at stations and sidings, and dispersal of railway operations to make target identification more difficult. None of these measures proved fully effective against determined Soviet attacks. The fundamental vulnerability remained. A locomotive was a large, distinctive target that could not effectively maneuver, could not be quickly hidden, and whose destruction immobilized entire trains laden with critical supplies. The Aerocobra's combat record on the Eastern Front remains curiously underappreciated in Western histories of World War II, overshadowed by more famous aircraft types and more dramatic aerial battles. Western aviation historians traditionally focused on the air war over Germany, the Battle of Britain, and Pacific theater campaigns where American and British aircraft achieved clear superiority and decisive victories. The Eastern Front Air War received less attention in English-language histories despite involving larger forces, higher losses, and arguably more decisive impacts on ground operations. This historical neglect reflects partly the Cold War period when Soviet combat records remained largely inaccessible to Western researchers, and partly genuine differences in operational focus that made Eastern Front air operations seem less relevant to Western air power doctrine. The Soviet emphasis on ground attack missions and direct support of ground forces appeared less sophisticated than Western strategic bombing campaigns and independent fighter operations. Soviet victories seemed to result from overwhelming numbers and enemy mistakes rather than technical sophistication or tactical innovation. These comfortable Western assumptions obscured genuine Soviet achievements in developing effective tactical methods for the specific operational conditions they faced. Soviet pilots like Pokryshkin demonstrated professional competence and tactical innovation that equaled anything Western aces achieved, adapting available equipment to mission requirements rather than demanding equipment that matched theoretical specifications. The Airacobra locomotive killing campaign represented sophisticated operational planning, systematic execution, and clear understanding of how to achieve strategic effects through accumulated tactical successes. Pokryshkin survived the war itself, a notable achievement for a fighter pilot who flew over 600 combat missions and continued serving in the Soviet Air Force through the post-war period, eventually retiring as a Marshal of Aviation. His memoir, published in Russian during the 1970s, provided detailed accounts of his combat experiences, including extensive discussion of Airacobra operations, but received limited distribution in translation and remained largely unknown to Western audiences until after the Soviet Union's collapse. The thousands of Soviet pilots who flew Airacobras in combat developed professional appreciation for an aircraft that Western air forces had rejected. They recognized its limitations. The tendency toward flat spins required careful handling, the high-altitude performance remained mediocre, and the car door entry created complications during emergency egress. But they also recognized its strengths: devastating armament, adequate low-altitude performance, good visibility, reliable radio equipment by Soviet standards, and relatively effective cockpit heating for high-altitude missions over Russian winter landscapes. German locomotive losses to air attack during 1943 and 1944 contributed significantly to the logistics crisis that progressively degraded Wehrmacht combat effectiveness on the Eastern Front. Precise statistics remain difficult to establish from incomplete German records, but available evidence suggests Soviet air interdiction destroyed or damaged several hundred locomotives during this period, losses that German industry could not replace while simultaneously maintaining production of tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and other war materials at levels necessary to contest Soviet offensives. The cumulative effect of these locomotive losses manifested in delayed reinforcements, inadequate ammunition supplies, fuel shortages, and degraded mobility that reduced German forces' ability to conduct the mobile defensive operations that might have prolonged the war. German commanders found themselves fighting with insufficient supplies, not because their logistics personnel lacked competence or organization, but because Soviet interdiction systematically destroyed the transportation infrastructure necessary to move supplies from factories and depots to combat units. The Airacobra story ultimately demonstrates how operational success depends on matching available equipment to actual mission requirements rather than pursuing abstract performance metrics that may have limited operational relevance. Soviet forces succeeded with the P-39 because they employed it according to its genuine capabilities, rather than forcing it into roles for which it was fundamentally unsuited. They accepted its limitations at high altitude as irrelevant to missions conducted primarily below 10,000 feet. They exploited its heavy cannon armament against targets vulnerable to that specific weapon. They adapted maintenance procedures to field conditions rather than demanding factory-perfect facilities. Western air forces rejected the same aircraft because their operational requirements emphasized different characteristics, where the Airacobra's weaknesses proved decisive, and its strengths offered little advantage. This divergent assessment reflected neither American incompetence nor Soviet genius, but rather fundamentally different tactical situations requiring different solutions. The Eastern Front Air War was not the Western European Air War, and aircraft optimized for one environment performed differently in the other. The German experience dismissing the Airacobra based on theoretical assessment, then discovering through painful experience that those assessments failed to account for how Soviet forces would actually employ the aircraft, illustrated the dangers of evaluating enemy capabilities based on assumptions about how enemy forces should operate rather than careful analysis of how they actually do operate. German intelligence officers had correctly assessed the Airacobra's specifications, but incorrectly predicted its operational impact because they failed to imagine that Soviet tactical doctrine might differ fundamentally from their own. Assumptions. The morning of March 7, 1943, when Aleksandr Pokryshkin destroyed that German locomotive near Smolensk, represented one tactical success among thousands during the brutal Eastern Front fighting. But that single locomotive's destruction contributed incrementally to the systematic degradation of German logistics that made Soviet victory possible. The massive battles, dramatic breakthroughs, and heroic stands receive historical attention, but wars are won through accumulated small victories, destroyed locomotives, interdicted supply columns, disrupted communications that collectively render enemy forces unable to sustain operations, regardless of individual courage or tactical skill. The Airacobra, laughed at by Luftwaffe pilots and rejected by Western air forces, proved itself where it mattered, in sustained combat operations under brutal conditions against a determined enemy. Its 37mm cannon destroyed hundreds of locomotives, thousands of vehicles, and contributed to Soviet victory through systematic application of overwhelming firepower against vulnerable targets. That the aircraft achieving these results was considered obsolete by the forces that designed it merely emphasizes how operational success depends on tactical employment rather than abstract specifications. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos